Yeah. So, Diane, yeah, I'd love to entertain your questions.
So, is there such a thing as unjust retribution? Like, for you, when do you think retribution goes too far? Like, maybe arguably, maybe the death penalty for stealing could be too far, or maybe spreading the name of the offender on the news may be too far.
Yeah.
or
So,
something?
yeah. So I think there's like you can argue that certain ways we provide retribution is unjustified. So it varies about the extents. So in a debate, whether you're gov or op, you're always going to argue if the issue of retribution comes up, why your side provides the correct extent or the fairest or more balanced extent. Yeah. Does that answer your question? So my answer is yes. And if your opponent argues that yours is like too much or too low, you will argue for your side that no, ours is the right extent or most balanced or most reasonable extent. Any more? Yeah.
That's the real.
Cool. How about anyone else?
Is restoration sort of similar to a positive eye for an eye?
No, the eye for an eye concept is more about retribution. Right?
About inflicting harm?
Yeah. It's like the code of Hammurabi. Not entirely sure. Fact check me on that, but I think that's where it came from. Right?
Is it
Like-
still an eye and an eye if you cause more harm than the quote unquote offender did?
Yeah, I think the premise of an eye for an eye type of justice is something that has to be equal.
Okay.
But before the book I read from *Sapiens*, before even in the Code of Hammurabi, like if you injure someone,
You're supposed to get
your slave will have to get killed or injured.
What?
Or like if someone injured your woman slave, there's like 20 pieces of silver you have to pay the owner of that woman. That's crazy. So that before, that's the concept of justice, like way back in history. But now we have been evolving to like penal codes and constitutions in terms of what is more in line with justice and what serves people better.
So they
To the
don't
right
think
extent.
people are like that.
Yeah.
But no, like in the retribution, right?
You wanna
For example-
speak louder?
For example, the motion talks about terrorism and how they committed violation in human rights. Like for example, they tortured someone. If it's in retribution, could you like fight that once they get caught, that they could be that the same thing that they did to the victims could be
Torture
done to
them.
them?
Yeah, if the motion calls for that.
Torture them as well.
I mean, it depends. It depends what context you're speaking in. Are you talking about you're a law, like you're a congressman and you want to impose a new law? That's a different way to defend that compared to like you're assigned a motion and then you have to defend a certain way. So it really depends on the context of where you're speaking from. Did I get to answer that question?
Justice is served.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But the police first motion, I couldn't get it. Parang prosecute domestic violence. What do you mean?
That means that they're gonna be in trials. So so what we can assume from the first motion is that the victim has to consent that the offender needs to be prosecuted. If there's no consent of the victim, then the prosecutor won't be offended. So like a government setup or policy would be like, oh, once we find out, we won't wait for the victim to say go ahead and prosecute the offender. The state will just go.
Is it necessary to say na parang... Or,
Depends, are you gov or op?
If I'm an arch, is it necessary for me to know what's the way to find out? Like parang, kasi sabi nyo, if we find out, is it important for you to say na parang, how do we find out about it? Or no?
Well, in the case here, where in terms of this house believes that, it's more of assessing whether or not. So I don't think it's as necessary compared to a motion that says this house would prosecute domestic violence even when we don't obtain the consent of the victim. So depends on the context of how the motion is framed. All right, you guys have any questions? No more? All right, go.